everyone, Brian Hilbert with Anglers Covey, coming at you with another edition of Bug of the Month, where we're going to be talking about blue-wing olives. So about this time last year, one of our guys, Luhring, did an excellent video on targeting blue-wing olives from the adult phase and fishing them with a dry fly. If you'd like to check out that video, we'll put a link in the description below. Be sure to check it out. There's a lot of great info there. Today, we're primarily going to be talking about targeting fish that are feeding on blue-wing olive nymphs and emergers from a subsurface technique. Blue-wing olives, one could argue, is the most prevalent insect that trout will feed on, aside from a midge, throughout the year. We have a massive blue-wing olive hatch that occurs and lasts for months in the springtime. We'll start to see them as early as February, really picking up in March, and then April kind of being peak time. And then again in fall, we'll see them come to be active again. We'll start seeing a few in late August, early September, and depending on the weather, cloudy days, you'll start to see huge blue-wing olive hatches that happen late September, October, on into the fall. It's late November now. We're still seeing really heavy blue-wing olive hatches happen on our local waters. We got some beautiful weather happening here today. It's about 68 degrees. And as long as that warm weather holds out, you're going to have great blue-wing olive hatches happening even through the winter. So blue-wing olives are, in my opinion, they might be our most complex mayfly when it comes to how we target them, when we target them, and where we target them. Not only is it important to have the right fly in size and color, but also to be fishing at the right depth with the right amount of weight and the right kind of water where trout want to feed on them. There's basically two key parts of a blue-wing olive hatch that happen subsurface where trout will be targeting blue-wing olive nymphs. What we call the pre-emergence is where the nymphs aren't emerging yet, however they are getting active. This is usually happening first thing in the morning. You're not seeing any adults flying around. You're not seeing any fish moving into the riffles. You're not seeing fish feeding mid-column. What is happening is those nymphs are starting to get active. They're crawling around, they're getting dislodged and swimming downstream or getting dislodged by the current and becoming in a catastrophic drift as they come downstream. And trout will target these during that time as just more of an opportunistic, they see the nymph coming down and they're going to eat it. These nymphs are typically your patterns like your pheasant tail, your hare's ear, once, Jedi Master, Baetis, all that look like the blue-wing olive nymph, which we're going to show you what a blue-wing olive mayfly looks like when it's in the pre-emergent stage. So during the pre-emergence, typically the kind of water that we're going to be fishing, it's going to be those deeper runs, the pools, the trenches and drop-offs, where fish are kind of holding. They're not necessarily really active in feeding. You're not seeing them come up and move around. They're really just sitting on the bottom and they're waiting for that hatch to happen. What we want to target at that point, when that's going on, is having our nymphs deep and just barely ticking along the bottom. We're going to show you today the type of rig I like to use for fishing this stage, and also my favorite flies that I like to fish during the pre-emergence. Okay, so I want to start off here by talking about the pre-emergence process and my strategy. So pre-emergence, as I mentioned earlier, just means what trout are going to be feeding on when it comes to blue-wing olives before the hatch actually happens. The good way to know you're in the pre-emergence is when you arrive to the river, you don't see any bugs. You don't see any fish feeding in the riffles, you don't see them in the shallows, you're not seeing them swim around, you're not collecting any or seeing any insects floating down just under the surface. There's really nothing going on. I'm going to implement a drop shot system in a pretty deep rig, and if you'd like to know more about fishing the drop shot, we have several classes available that are kind of a 301 style nymphing class, both in the classroom and on the water. Check out our website for availability for those classes. But I'm basically going to have my weighted crawfish on the bottom. I like fishing a crawfish on our local tailwater here. There's a lot of crawdads, trout love to eat them. And above that, I'm just going to have a couple of blue-wing olive nymphs, wands, Jedi Master, and then just a small pheasant tail. I want to position these nymphs just up off the bottom and target slower, deeper pools or places that trout are just going to be kind of staging and not necessarily actively feeding, but more or less just hanging out waiting for that hatch to happen. So I want to work this like a grid, starting pretty close and working out little by little. I like to tell clients to think of the water out in front of them as a chessboard full of 1 inch by 1 inch squares. I want to cover every square on the board when I'm fishing this pre-emergence. These trout often, when the bugs aren't going, are going to not really be willing to move very far for a fly. You're going to have to darn near hit them on the nose. So next we're going to talk about the emergence, okay? And the emergence means that nymph has decided it is time for him to ascend to the surface and to hatch into an adult. Think of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. Those nymphs are going to swim towards the surface, and it's a pretty fast ascension. They're not a turbo swimmer like so, but in a matter of minutes, they're making their way to the surface, and they're very vulnerable at this time. Those trout know exactly when that blueing olive emergence is happening and will change their behavior completely and the type of water that they're in to feed most efficiently to be able to eat as many of those nymphs as they can in the shortest window as possible. There's some key things that you can look for when that emergence starts to happen. Generally, the trout are going to move into shallow riffles, and obviously the best way to know that that has happened is having a great pair of polarized sunglasses, and you'll actually see the fish move into the shallows. They'll sometimes get as shallow as a foot or less into that riffly fast water where the feeding window is much smaller, condensing all those nymphs that are swimming towards the surface. So imagine, if you will, a trout is there and can just move slightly side to side, intercepting those emergences as they're swimming by, and it's much easier and more efficient feeding for them as opposed to being in 4 or 5 feet of water where maybe they got to move several feet over at a time to eat. Trout want to be as efficient as feeders as possible, and targeting those emergers in the riffle is a very efficient way for those trout to feed. Trout will continue to feed on those emergers in the riffles for up to several hours. As long as there's bluing olives emerging and ascending through the surface, trout will be more than happy to stay in that faster water and feed efficiently on those emerging insects. The next stage you're going to see is bluing olives flying around, and a few of them are riding along the surface of the water, and trout are going to start to rise to them. Again, Neil did an excellent video on fishing the bluing olive and the dry fly technique, and we're going to put the link down in the description. I highly recommend checking that out. One thing I do want to point out is a big mistake anglers make is they'll see trout start to rise during a bluing olive hatch and immediately switch to a dry fly. I really encourage you to watch very, very, very closely at how those trout are rising to those insects. If you're seeing a nose come out of the water, those trout are eating the adult. If all you're seeing is a dorsal fin followed by a tail, or just the tail or a boil, they're eating emergers just a few inches under the surface. So make sure you're really paying attention to how those trout are coming up and feeding so you know how to approach your strategy. The trout really aren't coming up for the adults yet, but we are starting to see some trout feed in this shallower, faster stuff. Now, trout, in my opinion, really love to eat the emergers in shallow and fast water. This water here, there's some really complex currents and swirling water. I'll be implementing that high stick technique through most of it. Sticking with that drop shot setup. I really like this setup to fish the emergence. We'll see if we can find a trout. There we go. I could see that fish eating there mid-column. He would come up off the bottom ever so slightly, about a foot, to eat those emergers. I got right in there in that faster water. He took that top fly. Nice rainbow. He took that bar's emerger, my top fly, and that drop shot setup. It's 3 feet or so below the indicator. He was feeding on those blueing olive emergers. Great fish. So a good way to get collect some data on the size and color of blue wings in the particular river that you're fishing is to use a seine. We sell these at the shop. These are a very important tool to have on you in your fly fishing arsenal. Now, if I wanted to just see what the emergers were doing, I would simply just place the net in the water like this in a shallow riffle, and I would wait for 3 or 4 minutes and see what was happening. If I wanted to collect data on size and color, I'd put that net same place on the bottom and stir it up with my boot, see what I can dislodge. The seine will then catch anything that I knock loose with my boot, and we can collect our data. All right, so our top 3 flies that we like to fish for blue wing olives. First, for the pre-emergence. As I mentioned earlier, Juan's Jedi Master Betas, a pheasant tail, and a hare's ear are all great options. For the emergence, we really like Phil Torrella's Lightsaber BWO, a Bar's Emerger, and also the timeless classic, the RS2. An olive RS2 is one of my favorite flies to fish during the emergence. All right, so that's bug of the month for blue wing olives. If you guys are interested in dialing your nymphing game or learning more about the drop shot system we use today, check out our available classes here. Our upcoming winter class is a great nymphing class and gives a great opportunity to sharpen your skills as an angler. Questions or comments, drop them below. Other than that, we hope to see you guys out on the water.